Hi, and welcome to this dry run for automating provisioning for your digital workplace with Azure Durable Functions and the Microsoft Graph. This is a dry run for the September 2019 Microsoft Graph community call. Before I begin, let me introduce myself. I am Vincent Viret, a Microsoft Office Dev MVP. I also work as an Azure and Office 365 developer at 22lead, which is a Canadian-based consulting company, myself being based out of Montreal. And if you want to reach out to me, you can reach me via Twitter, my blog, or in the chat or in the comments. Before we dive into the technical implementation and technical details, let's first set up context for what we're trying to achieve and why we're trying to achieve it. If we look at the Microsoft 365 ecosystem over the years, we can see that it has evolved and become more complex over the years. If we look back into 2012, it was fairly simple, right? Because we had at the time only SharePoint for document offering and collaboration, Outlook for communication, OneNote for note-taking, and sometimes projects. So this is all that our users were using for their digital workplace in the very early days. Now, if we look at 2013, Microsoft acquired Yammer for kind of this change of trend in terms of collaboration and communication and working out loud trend and all those things. And then in 2015, Microsoft developed something called the Office 365 groups or the unified groups, which are a bundle of multiple things, including what you have from Exchange, SharePoint, and a few other things. And also came and started to develop the Power Platform, starting with Power BI for dashboarding and self-service data. Now, in 2016 was a busy year. We got Microsoft Teams for Teams collaborations and communications, Flow for workplace automation, Planner for Teams self-organizations and project self-organizations, Power Apps as a way to build very complex, actually, applications for the end users. And then from the education space, we got Microsoft Forms in 2017 to build very simple and lightweight forms and digital forms, and so on and so forth, right? So if we look at that from a different angle, we can see that those tools cover different boundaries. And keep in mind, this is only an example. Multiple organizations will place those tools on different boundaries. It's not because you're not using those tools in that specific context that you're doing anything wrong. It's just an example again. Most of the time for internal boundaries, so internal means working with your team and your close collaborators, we'll use tools like Planner, Teams, OneNote, sometimes Flow, sometimes Project, sometimes for the external. So the external boundary is not only your company, but also your contractors or some of your close customers or people that are not part of your immediate organization, but with whom you interact from a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, right? And you use things like the external email capability from Office 365 groups or SharePoint to share files with them, or some applications or dashboard you built with Power BI or Power Apps, right? And lastly, you have the public boundary. So those are people that you don't necessarily know. You interact with them on a monthly, yearly basis. They are not necessarily authenticated in the company through the classic authentication mechanisms, and you do things like polling them and asking them for feedback or for some basic data, right? You can use products and services like Microsoft Forms. You want to build a small community of Power users, and so we can provide feedback again on your products and services. So you'll use Yammer to create a discussion space. And finally, good old traditional emails with Outlook, right? Again, this is an example. Different companies might be using the tools in different ways, but you can see that over the last few years, and as capabilities increased and scenarios became more and more complex, we have a variety of different tools to support for different teams, for different projects, for different divisions, and that made IT's work a bit more complex over time, right? So what are the effects of having more specialized tools? Well, first, because they are specialized, often they're more efficient. Instead of doing 12 different things, they do 2 things, but they do it very well, and you gain efficiency by doing that, right? They also have better capabilities because they are, again, focused on some aspects. They can integrate with other tools to create more value and to provide more capabilities, and again, that translates into more efficiency. You get also faster releases because each and every tool or product or service has dedicated product teams or at Microsoft. Well, and because they are focused on what they're building, they can iterate faster independently from other tools. They don't have to wait too much on this platform to update before they can publish a new feature. So you get new versions faster and on a more reliable cadence. The cons being lots of context switching, because you have one tool to do one thing, another tool to do another thing, a third tool to do a third thing. Users keep switching tabs or tools all the time and all day long, and that can bring inefficiencies as well as stress to the end users, right? It also brings licensing complexity. As you have more tools, you need to care about more licensing scenarios and provision those licenses, well, acquire those licenses at the first place. All of that is added complexity for IT. We have multiple APIs available, so for Microsoft 365 developers, it's more APIs to know about, authentication to figure out, and so on and so forth. So that also brings complexity in building integration products and services. And lastly, when you're talking about things like, hey, my team needs this new set of tools or set of this new workspace to be able to collaborate and create value for the company and so on and so forth. Because again, we have more tools, they are more specialized, it means more administrative lifecycle tasks, things like, well, at the first place, creating the different environments and instances and so on, securing those, making sure they are audited, as well as decommissioning those when they are not used as well, right? If we try to tackle all these negative aspects, well, Microsoft already kind of addressed the context switching part for us, thanks to the to Microsoft Teams, right? With Microsoft Teams, you have this capability of not only creating a team, but adding your tabs and making sure that everything is at one place within the context of what you're doing with that specific team, and you can stay within Teams again. So it means you don't need to have 12,000 tools open and you don't need to switch tabs all the time, right? The second one is licensing. Well, we don't talk about licensing, right? The licensing is a whole subject by itself, and the best thing when you want to talk about licensing is to talk to Microsoft directly, and they will figure out an answer for you. So we will kind of work around that complexity, right? Well, now if we talk about the APIs, and we're on the Microsoft Graph community call, so you probably all know or already know that there is one unified API, which is a Microsoft Graph, which simplifies a lot of aspects into querying Microsoft 365 services and making sure you can build integration solutions and so on and so forth, right? So Microsoft, again, already provided an answer for us. But we're still left with that specific negative aspect, which is the administrative lifecycle tasks, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, and making sure that we provide a solution for that, right? And we will be focusing today on the specific case of provisioning the different tools and the different environment and the different workspaces for our teams, project, whatever it is, right? To make sure that our users are not only independent from IT, but also very well served by IT, and they can straight ahead create whatever they need to create, still respecting IT's governance plans and strategies and so on and so forth, and be efficient and create value as soon as possible for the company, not waiting for IT or anyone else. What things do we want to automate in that scenario? Well, things like creating an Office 365 group, enabling team on the group, setting up the logo, the security, creating the channels, creating notebooks with templated notes, adding a planner plan for each project, while adding a welcoming message so people know that something new is available and they can start talking about it and collaborating and so on and so forth. Adding all the tabs, so again, they don't have an empty shell, they have already something usable and that brings value to them. And things like creating extranet site collections and sites and applying templates to those and so on, right? Now, if you want to start creating a provisioning solution for your end users, and if you want to enable true self-service, the very first question you will have to ask yourselves is, how do we collect data? How do we make sure that we provide a comprehensive UI to our end users so they can tell us what they want? And after telling that to us, well, it starts creating what they need exactly, right? In Microsoft 365, we have a set of different options here, and keep that slide format for in head for the next few minutes, because we're going to be reusing it. On the very left, with the arrow that goes up, you'll see that the more up you go, the more control you get over the solution, so you'll be able to do more complex things, right? But the more you go to the right, you'll have also complexity. So the tool might be enabling you to do more things, but you will also require you more technical skills and might take more technical time, technical implementation time, and so on. The first one and the easiest one is Microsoft Forms. Again, Microsoft Forms is the solution that enables you to create very simplistic forms with basic fields and submit that data that was entered there to some other place. That includes things like SharePoint and other places, and based on that you can then automate and trigger something that is going to automate things, right? It is a very valid solution if it suits your needs. Again, for the slides that look like that with those two arrows, we'll keep something in mind, right? All the options listed on the slides are valid options for what we're talking about. Then it's a matter of, is that option valid in your particular context? And the best way to evaluate that is to start from the left, to start evaluating the tool that is the least complex and is the easiest to implement to bring value as fast as possible. And if it works for you, amazing. Pick it up, use that, and start implementing something. If it does not, well, move to the more right side of the solutions offered here, right? The second one, which is a bit more complex, is Microsoft Power Apps. Again, it's this solution that enables you to create more complex applications and then distribute them to devices, the end user devices, or as web applications as well. And again, it's a bit more complex because now we're not talking only about forms, but we also are talking about different screens and UI interaction and data validation and a lot of other things. Again, it enables you to do many more things, but it's a bit more complex. It might be sufficient in your scenario, it might not be. It's really up to your scenario and you to evaluate that. The next logical step is to leverage Microsoft Teams and SharePoint Framework extensibility capabilities to build custom web parts or components that will allow your users to enter data, and then based on that data you can do a web service call and start some kind of processing, right? This is more on the development skills aspect of things, and this will allow you to build those kind of solutions only if you have development skills. It's not that complex if you already have development skills, but it also brings goodies like comprehensive development lifecycle management, like continuous integration, continuous testing, continuous deployment, versioning, and all those things that allow you to have a more structured way to manage your solution and evolve it over time, right? The next and very valid option is to leverage bots. We've been hearing a lot about bots over the last few years. Those are conversational agents that users can talk to, and the bots can reply or start processing in the cloud. And it's a very good way to guide the user towards the solution they might not know they want, but they actually need at the end of the day through a conversation. Like, hey, I want to start a new project. All right, can you tell me more about that? This new project. Is it a project with that kind of customer, or this kind of customer, or in this kind of context? And then through questions and answers, you can guide the user and start provisioning whatever they need, right? And lastly, you can go fully custom with a fully custom application, but that will come at a few drawbacks, like losing integrated authentication and authorization, losing integrated hosting, and so on and so forth. So I would generally avoid going fully custom unless you absolutely need it, and leverage the other solutions instead. Now that we have talked about capturing the data and interacting with the user and bringing a UI, the next logical thing you will want to do once you have the data is, automating things, right? And again, the most basic and the easiest thing to implement is Microsoft Flow, which is you've probably used it in the past, or at least have heard about that. It's this user-centric way of defining workflows and automating things and implementing solutions. But it often comes to limitations in terms of capabilities, in terms of licensing, in terms of management by IT. So the next logical step after Microsoft Flow is a Logic App. And the great thing is, as Logic App is more developer-centric solution, it's perfectly feasible to start as a flow and say, all right, we'll build a prototype or build a V1 in Microsoft Flow and start automating things. And then as you reach the limitations of Microsoft Flow, you can export that flow as a Logic App, export it to the IT or development team and say, all right, development team or IT, please now take it over. Make sure it respects the proper corporate development standards and so on and so forth. And they will be able to augment it. So it doesn't mean that because you started with Flow and then you want to extend on that, well, you need to throw everything away, right? You can keep your current investments, extend on those, and transfer that to IT through Logic Apps. So that's a very appealing choice and appealing path to say, all right, we start with Flow and then we transition over to Logic Apps. The next logical one or more complementary option is Microsoft Azure Functions. Functions are serverless solutions or serverless service in the cloud by Microsoft via Azure. And what they allow you to do is care only about the line of business logic code and not care about the yet another writing code to connect to the database or connect to the storage or secure your API or whatever you're building, right? You only have to care about the line of business logic, and we'll be extending more on that a bit later on, right? Web apps are, again, a bit more complex, a bit more complete way of building APIs and automating things in the cloud. They can be hosted on Azure Web Apps. There is not such a great transition from Flow to Web Apps that you could have with Flow to Logic Apps, but still it's one way you can build things if you want to. And they usually also provide something called Azure Web Jobs, web app being the more user-facing or front-facing part of the equation, and the web job being the background running service or background running task available in the cloud. So again, Logic Apps, Functions, Web Apps, Web Jobs are more developer-focused solutions. On the more IT Pro focused way of building things is Azure Automation Runbooks. So those allow you to run scripts, including PowerShell in the cloud, without having the need to provision a virtual machine or a server or whatever it is, right? You just need to provide your scripts, and they're very robust. They've been there for a couple of years. they're much different from the other solutions, but they will be more appealing to IT pros. And lastly, you can again go fully custom, but again, this is going to come at a lot of trade-offs, and it's usually better to leverage one of the other 6 options you have before that. And the other great thing is all of Logic Apps, Functions, Web Apps, and Web Jobs, they run on a single common thing, which is called the App Service Environment in Azure. And they share a lot of common properties and behaviors and capabilities, things like automatically providing SSL support, automatically providing authentication and authorization validation, things like handling cores for you, and so on and so forth, right? So my general advice here will be to start prototyping with Flow if you can, and then augment those with Azure Functions whenever you need. And if that doesn't suit your solution properly, either go right away to Azure Functions or migrate your flow to a Logic App and build on top of that, right? If you stay in the Logic App and Azure Functions kind of space, again, you'll get a lot of goodies from Azure and Azure App Service Environment that you don't get otherwise, and that will save you a ton of time. So during that session, I chose to leverage SharePoint Framework Web Part as a form to let the user discover and enter the data and guide them through successfully provisioning their solution. And then for the backend part, for the part that does the heavy lifting, I implemented that using Azure Durable Functions, and we'll talk a bit more about Azure Durable Functions right after. So if we jump into the demonstration for a couple of minutes, you can see that I have a few things running and debugging in the backend, but more importantly, this is what my web part looks like, and this is what I provide to the user. So here we're talking about provisioning for things like new customers. Like, let's imagine we're a consulting company. It doesn't matter what kind of consulting, right? And we have customers, and for each customer we have projects, right? And now IT was tired of manually provisioning all the different customers spaces and the different project workspaces, because that takes time, it's error prone, and so on and so forth. So we built that solution that helps the users provision things themselves by just providing the data here. At TutuLead, if you become a TutuLead customer, the first thing we will give you is a customer code. It's usually a 3 letters code. So in our case, we'll say graph dry run GDR. Again, we're leveraging Office 365 groups to copy all the emails and to make sure that anytime we communicate with you or the customers communicates with us, we copy that to keep tracks of our communications. So we'll use the same acronym, and then it's going to be graph run. We can give it a description also as a logo. I'll use my own picture to avoid any copyright issue. And then the next logical thing is whenever we engage with a customer, we start a project, and that project usually gets a code, which is a 3 numbers code. It gets a title, so demo project for call. We can give it a description again. And for the last part, we're talking about security or permissions, if you want. So we have usually 2 main roles in a project. Besides the functional roles, we have the people that can own and manage a project, and we have the people that are just members and can collaborate only, right? So here I don't have a lot of users in my demo tenant. I'm going to use those 2 users. Now, while this is being created, let's switch back to the slides for a couple of minutes. And we will talk about Azure Durable Functions rapidly. So I'm assuming most of you have experience with Azure Functions. Azure Functions are, again, that serverless solution based on Azure and app service environment. And usually the pros are where they are super cheap to run and execute and build. They're fast and performant. They're simple. They scale very well, and it's handled for you, so you don't have to care about that. But the trade-offs are they're stateless. They cannot maintain a state, and that led to very complicated things, right? Coordination became a nightmare, and the runtime is limited to 10 to 15 minutes depending on the plans. So if you have anything running longer, well, you are out of luck, basically. When we're talking about coordination and coordinating Azure functions, we had two main patterns. First one being chaining. Let's say you have one function and the other one and a second function, and the second function needs to start whenever the first one is finished. Well, usually you would add a queue between those two, and the first one would just send a message into the queue, and the second one would pick it up and start processing whenever new message was available, right? But you can imagine what's happening when you have lots of functions and lots of queues you need to set up in place. It becomes this kind of spaghetti plugging nightmare that is hard to debug, because if function number 3 fails, it's hard to understand, is it because it didn't get the message, is it because the message was not formatted properly, is it actually function 3 or function 2 that was faulting, and so on and so forth, right? Another pattern was we still have those functions, but instead we will rely on state repository, usually some kind of database, and say, all right, function 1 will run and put something in the database. So function 2 will continuously pull for data that's in the particular state it accepts. Whenever something is in the proper state, it will run and update the data, and so on and so forth, right? But again, it's not that easy, and that led to situations like that where coordinating functions was a nightmare, and especially when you had to debug those actually. So this is why the Azure Functions team delivered Azure Durable Functions almost a year ago now, and they have all the benefits of regular functions. In fact, they are regular functions. They are code-defined workflows, meaning that the idea is to define the structure of your logic on one end, and then the implementation of each and every atomic part on the other end, so that you can you can separate the logic, the control logic, from the actual implementation. It automates things for you like state management, it reports status automatically, it enables new design patterns like fan-in, fan-out, chaining, monitoring, and so on and so forth. How does this work? Well, take a traditional function that triggers on something. It can be an HTTP call, it can be a queue, it can be anything else, right? Well, you transform that function into an orchestration client. It will be in charge now of saying, hey, I want the workflow to start, I want a new instance of a workflow, and go do things, basically. And it will talk to something called an orchestrator. So that guy will be in charge of sequencing the logic and implementing the logic between, should I do action A or action B, should I continue, should I wait on an external event, and all those kind of things, as well as reporting the status and handling the state management. And then you'll break apart in each and every things into smaller functions that are called activities. Things like go create the group, then enable teams, then do something else with security, and so on and so forth, right? And behind the scenes, the state is persisted in Azure Blob Storage for you, but you don't have to care about that. It's automatically done for you. For important things, orchestrator will run multiple times, so you need to make sure that you build your code for that. Orchestrator, his job is only to coordinate activities. Don't do any random stuff. Don't do any time generation or any time comparison in there. Don't do any asynchronous call like HTTP call or anything like that. Use the logic that can be replayed many times, giving the same outcome if you have the same input. And yeah, make sure that whenever you call activities, use the orchestrator methods. Don't call the activities right away. And then, without further notice, let's jump to the demo. So here I do have my orchestration client. So whenever my shop on framework web part asks for a provisioning request, it's going to call that specific Azure function and make sure that it started, that's exposed as an API. Automatically, it's secured thanks to the Azure App Service environment and Azure Active Directory, and it will receive a call and then use the orchestration client to start a new instance with this orchestrator. If we look at the orchestrator, well, it has an orchestration context, and the only thing it does, as you can see, is report the status as well as call the different activities, things like creating the group, setting the logo, enabling teams, and so on and so forth. So if we look at, for example, creating the group, well, then it's really simple. I get the input that I'm passing down, and after doing that, I'm going to say, all right, is there already a group existing? If yes, I'm just fixing the security. If not, I'm using the Microsoft Graph SDK with the Graph Service client with the access token to make sure that I talk to the Microsoft Graph and say, hey, go create a group for me, please, and then set those different members and owners of the group. And if we go back a little bit, the next thing I'm doing is setting the logo. Not here, that's storing in the storage, but if I'm setting the logo here. So again, I'm getting the input and I'm saying, all right, give me a Graph Source client. I'm gonna load the logo from the storage, and then I'm going to upload the logo of a group here using the Graph SDK again, and you get the logic, right? And the great thing is you get all those different activities here that do certain things, like again setting the logo, creating the group, and many other things, and then you get that big coordinator. Another thing is you get an API to query the status and trigger event, but that's beyond the presentation of today. And with that, I will open for questions. So thank you very much for listening to me today, and don't hesitate if you have any questions. Bye bye.